Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It started the way most long-term resentments do, quietly, with something so small and seemingly insignificant that you convince yourself it's no big deal, just a kind gesture. Just one of those things you do because you love your family and you were raised to help without keeping score. That's what I told myself the first time I paid their power bill, years ago, when my mom called me on a Thursday evening with that particular tone in her voice, the one she always used when she needed something but didn't want to sound like she was asking. The utility company's being difficult again, she'd said, brushing it off like it was just a billing error, some computer glitch they couldn't sort out, and could I just this once, cover it until they figured things out? Of course, I said yes without hesitation. It wasn't even a question in my mind at the time. I was just starting to find my footing in my career, and that first grown-up paycheck had made me feel invincible, like I was finally able to give back to the people who had raised me, the people who had fed me, clothed me, and sacrificed when things were tight. That first transfer was only $200, just a blip on my bank statement, and when my mom called back to thank me, she said it like she was doing me a favor just by acknowledging it. "You're such a good girl," she'd said, warm and casual, like I'd done a small chore, not bridged the financial gap they'd been quietly living in for months. But one bill turned into another. And another. And then came the groceries, little text messages from my dad asking if I could grab a few things for your mom's fridge while I was out shopping. Then the gaps in rent started showing up, then the overdue insurance premiums, then the sudden, unexpected dental work that needed covering. I didn't argue. I just kept pulling out my card and solving problems, patching holes in a roof I didn't live under anymore. I told myself it was just part of being a good daughter, part of what it meant to show love when words weren't their strong suit. It wasn't like they ever asked for much emotionally, either. Not real conversation, not vulnerability, not warmth. That wasn't how our family worked. My dad was old school, the kind of man who thought affection was weakness and respect was something you demanded rather than earned. My mom played peacekeeper more than nurturer, always smoothing over awkward moments with a pot roast or a sigh. And my brother Eli? Well, he floated in and out of jobs, relationships, responsibilities, yet somehow always seemed to be greeted like a returning hero every time he stumbled back through their front door with another story about why things didn't work out this time either. Still, I kept giving. Not just money, but effort, thought, energy. I remembered birthdays, planned dinners, sent gift cards, just because. I covered their cell phone plan without saying a word when I saw it was about to get cut off. I even upgraded their internet package when my mom mentioned their shows kept buffering. And every time I helped, I told myself this was what love looked like: quiet, generous, patient. So when my dad's 60th birthday came around, I decided I wanted to do something meaningful. Something that would speak louder than 1,000 utility payments ever could. I'd been saving for months, not just for the money, but for the moment I could give it to him. I'd gone to the jewelry store myself, picked it out carefully, had it engraved on the inside with the words "With love, Rachel," subtle and clean. A Rolex. Not a showy one, but sleek, classic, timeless. A piece that said everything he never let me say out loud. When I handed him the box at his birthday dinner, surrounded by a few relatives and Eli, who had barely brought a card, I was nervous in a way I hadn't expected. Not because I thought he wouldn't like it, but because I hoped, deep down, that this time, finally, he might see me not just as the daughter who solved problems, but as someone who deserved a sliver of admiration, a flicker of appreciation. Something more than his usual nod. He opened the box slowly, glanced at the watch for all of 3 seconds, and then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, half amused, half dismissive. He cleared his throat, held the watch in his palm like it was just another pair of socks, and said flatly, "Respect can't be bought with money, son." It took me a second to realize what he'd said, especially the word son, which he'd used more like a dig than a slip of the tongue. My throat tightened, but I didn't say anything. I just sat there, nodded once, and smiled in a way I'd perfected over the years, tight-lipped, steady, unreadable. But inside, something cracked. And for the first time in years, I realized I was done. I don't think I've ever mastered the art of rage, not the loud kind, not the kind that flips tables or throws things across the room or screams until the air is too thick to breathe. No, my anger never looked like that. It came in waves beneath my skin, it sat heavy in the pit of my stomach, and it showed up in the smallest shifts: a tightened jaw, a half-second pause before I smiled, a softer tone than I intended when I answered. That night, sitting across from my father with a Rolex in his hand and a dismissive sentence lingering in the air like smoke, I felt that quiet rage coil itself around my ribs and settle in for the long haul. I didn't say a word. I didn't flinch. I just swallowed the moment whole and watched the others at the table glance at each other with that awkward tension people wear when they know something sharp has just passed through a room, but no one wants to acknowledge it. My mother smiled nervously and cleared her throat, probably hoping to pivot to dessert, and Eli, ever the oblivious golden child, leaned back in his chair and mumbled something about how nice the watch looked anyway. But I heard it, clear as day, echoing louder in my ears than anything else had all evening. Respect can't be bought with money, son. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was everything underneath them. It was the years of effort swept under the rug. It was every grocery run, every paid bill, every quiet act of service that was received like a transaction rather than a gesture. It was the way they always found a way to reduce what I gave into something impersonal, something clinical, something not quite worthy of gratitude. And the worst part was, I hadn't even been trying to buy respect. I'd just been trying to earn a seat at a table that always felt one chair too short. Have you ever poured yourself into someone financially, emotionally, completely, and they still acted like you owed them more? Ever given your best and been met with a shrug? Tell me in the comments. I know I'm not the only one. I know there are others out there who've bent themselves backward, held families together with duct tape and sacrifice, only to be told they're too much, not enough, or somehow still falling short. It's a strange kind of grief, the kind that comes not from loss, but from the painful realization that what you thought was love was just quiet expectation in disguise. My father had never once acknowledged how I'd carried that house on my back without asking for anything in return. He never mentioned the fact that I covered their car insurance for 3 years straight when Eli crashed his second-use sedan, and they were too embarrassed to tell anyone. He never thanked me for staying late after work to help fix their internet router because they didn't want to call customer service. He never praised me for putting my own financial goals on hold so I could make sure they didn't fall behind on their mortgage during that rough patch 5 years ago. But he'd always had plenty to say about Eli. How at least he's trying. How he's got potential. How he just needs some time. Every little effort Eli made, a part-time job that lasted 3 months, a failed startup idea, a spontaneous road trip that turned into him sleeping on their couch again, was met with wide-eyed encouragement and applause. Meanwhile, I could bring in a promotion, a raise, an award, and the most I'd get was a distracted, "Oh yeah, your mom mentioned that." It was never about the money. That was just the currency I used to bridge the gap between what I gave and what they refused to see. But sitting there in that moment, watching my father hold a watch he'd never wear with meaning, listening to his words flatten years of effort into a moral lesson I never asked for, I finally saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't about a birthday gift. It wasn't about pride or principle or old-fashioned values. It was about control. It was about keeping me in a place where nothing I did could ever be enough, because enough would mean acknowledging that I'd risen beyond the box they'd always kept me in. Enough would mean saying thank you. Enough would mean giving me the one thing they refused to hand over, not praise, not money, not affection, but simple, honest respect. I picked up my wine glass slowly, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make everyone at the table a little uncomfortable. I took a sip, placed it gently on the table, and smiled, not wide, not warm, just enough to cut the air between us. "Noted," I said softly. And in that tiny word, buried beneath all the politeness, was a quiet promise they didn't recognize yet, but soon would. The thing about pulling away from people who've grown used to feeding off your kindness is that you don't have to slam any doors or make grand declarations for them to feel the shift. It only takes a few quiet adjustments, a few threads slowly pulled from a fabric they never realized you'd been weaving for them all along. So I didn't argue. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make a scene about fairness or entitlement or how much it hurt to feel like a walking ATM machine dressed in daughter skin. I just started making small changes, subtle enough that no one would notice, at least, not right away. The first thing I did was cancel the auto payments on their utility accounts, those silent transactions that had been drafted from my bank every month without a single thank you text, without a single conversation. I logged in, unchecked the boxes, rerouted my own finances, and closed the email alerts that had long since turned into reminders of just how much I'd given for people who acted like it was owed. The electricity, the water, the gas, the cell phone plan, I had tied so many pieces of my life to theirs without even realizing how entangled I'd become. Next, I called the insurance company and removed myself as the backup payer on their car insurance policy. I took my name off the shared grocery delivery account and deleted the saved credit card on file. I stopped sending the quiet extras, the household supplies, the pharmacy copays, the little things they never noticed until they were gone. I didn't explain. I didn't give them a heads up. I just pulled the threads one by one, gently and without warning, and waited for the unraveling to begin. It didn't take long. About 2 weeks later, I got the first text from my mother. "Hey, sweetheart, do you know why the internet isn't working? The bill says it's overdue, but I thought it was on autopay." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying with a casual, "Oh, I assumed you were handling it now. Hope it's not too much trouble." A few days after that, she followed up again. "Also, do you remember which pharmacy we used for Dad's medication? They said there's an issue with the payment method." I responded politely, "You might need to update your info with them. Let me know if you need help." But I didn't offer to cover it. I didn't volunteer a dime. And every time she hinted at something, another bill, another errand, another logistical favor, I kept my tone warm, even helpful, but never opened my wallet. Then Eli called me, sounding just as lazy and self-assured as ever. "Hey, Ratch, you think you could spot me a little gas money? I've got a job interview on Friday, but I'm short this week." I paused for half a second, long enough to hear the assumption in his voice, the casual certainty that of course I'd come through again. "You should ask Mom and Dad," I said softly, holding my voice steady and kind. "I'm sure they'll help you out." There was a silence on the line, the kind that says more than any argument ever could. He mumbled something about it being just a little thing, and hung up, probably already planning to show up at their doorstep with his usual tired excuses and empty promises. And then came the real moment, the one that finally made me see just how deep the entitlement ran. My father, the same man who'd looked me in the eye with that smug little smirk and told me respect couldn't be bought with money, brought it up casually over the phone a week later. "Things have been tight lately," he said, not quite asking, but definitely suggesting, his voice heavy with that vague disapproval that always seemed to come when the world didn't bend to his needs. "These bills are getting ridiculous. Everything's going up." I listened quietly, didn't rush to fill the silence with a solution, didn't offer to help like I used to. I just said, "Yeah, things are tough all over," and left it there like a stone in the middle of the conversation, unmoving and unyielding. He didn't push it further. He never had to before. But this time, he seemed unsure, a little off balance, like he was waiting for me to slide in and rescue them again. But I didn't. Later that night, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and clicked open a new tab. I opened a new account at a different bank, a completely separate one, unlinked from any shared bills, any family obligations, any remnants of the life I had been subsidizing for far too long. I named the account something simple but symbolic, my life. It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming the space I had never been given permission to fully occupy. And for the first time in years, it felt like something that was entirely mine. It wasn't the voicemail itself that got to me, it was the tone underneath the words, the strained attempt to sound casual when the desperation was leaking through every carefully chosen phrase like water seeping through cracked drywall. My mom's voice had always carried a kind of rehearsed politeness, the sort that makes strangers think everything's fine, even when the foundation is crumbling beneath her feet. But this time, she couldn't hide it. "Hey, sweetheart, just checking in," her message began. Too bright, too cheerful, too forced. "Your dad's been a little stressed lately, and we've had some trouble with the heater. Nothing serious, just a few repairs we weren't expecting. It's so cold this week, isn't it? Anyway, we're managing. I hope you're staying warm. Call me when you can." I didn't call her back. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally realized it wasn't my job to be the furnace they'd neglected to maintain in more ways than one. I sat there for a long time after listening to that voicemail, not angry, not even particularly hurt anymore, just hollow in that oddly liberating way that comes when you've stopped hoping for something that never really existed in the first place. For years, I'd been the invisible insulation in that house, quietly absorbing the cold so they could stay comfortable, and now they were finally starting to feel the chill. I could feel the shift happening, slowly but undeniably. My father, always the stern-faced patriarch with a voice that could make walls shrink, had grown more irritable than usual. Mom's texts were shorter, more clipped, less frequent. Eli, predictably, had started making comments to mutual friends about how things were getting tight back home and how it's weird having to pitch in more lately. He wasn't subtle, and he certainly wasn't graceful about it. The way he spoke made it sound like he was performing a public service by tossing a few bucks toward the cable bill or picking up groceries now and then, like stepping into a role I'd carried for nearly a decade was somehow an act of extraordinary sacrifice. I didn't argue with any of them. I didn't correct the narrative they were starting to build around me, the cold, distant daughter who had pulled away, the ungrateful one who forgot where she came from. I let them tell the story however they needed to tell it. Because I'd already lived the truth, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation for learning how to protect my peace. At a family gathering a few weeks later, a cousin's engagement party, one of those obligatory appearances I still attended out of habit rather than any real emotional connection. I felt the weight of whispers trailing behind me before I even walked through the door. People don't need to speak loudly to make you feel like a rumor with legs. It was in the sidelong glances, the small talk that evaporated when I entered a circle, the polite questions laced with pointed curiosity. It didn't take long for someone to bring it up. It was Aunt Carolyn, of course, the kind of woman who pretended her gossip was concern, who always wrapped judgment in soft tones and furrowed brows. "I heard your folks aren't doing too great lately," she said, swirling her wine glass and offering that thin, sympathetic smile that's always more condescending than kind. Donna mentioned something about bills piling up, and I thought, well, I just thought that must be hard for you to watch. I looked at her for a long second, the way you look at someone who's just accidentally said something true without realizing it. And then, without raising my voice or shifting my expression, I said, "I used to try to help." They didn't want help. They wanted control. The words hung in the air heavier than I expected, sinking into the space between us like a truth she didn't know how to respond to. Because that was the part no one ever said out loud, that sometimes help becomes a leash, and gratitude becomes a weapon, and giving turns into a quiet kind of prison if you let people convince you that your value only exists in what you provide. She didn't say anything after that. Just nodded and turned away, probably already crafting the next version of the story where I was cold, unfeeling, selfish. But I didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't the one freezing to keep everyone else warm. And I hadn't even started the real withdrawal yet. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, just my name printed neatly in my father's blocky handwriting, the kind that always looked like it belonged more on an invoice than a birthday card. I almost didn't open it right away. I left it sitting on the table for hours, like it was some kind of artifact from a world I had already walked away from, a relic of a relationship I no longer had the energy to revive. But curiosity, or maybe old habit, eventually got the better of me, and I slid it open carefully, expecting, what exactly? An apology? An explanation? maybe even something resembling honesty. Instead, it was a letter that read more like a chess move than a conversation, strategic, composed, loaded with half-truths and thinly veiled guilt, the kind of letter that tries to sound warm while still keeping you in your place. He started off by saying he'd been thinking a lot lately, a phrase he'd probably picked up from my mother after she'd run out of passive ways to say she was disappointed in me. He mentioned how proud he was of me, how he'd always known I'd do well for myself, and how it's no surprise that I've managed to build such a successful life. But somehow, even in those words, I could feel the sharpness underneath, the quiet accusation that my success had come at the cost of something else, of family, of tradition, of my place in the pecking order they'd crafted over the years. Then came the pivot I expected, the not-so-subtle request wrapped in concern. He wrote about how he missed seeing me, how the house had been quieter lately, how Mom had been a little low, and how it would mean a lot if I visited more often. He didn't ask for money, not directly, but the message was clear. He wanted presence. Not for connection, not because he missed my laughter or my stories or my company, but because the walls were starting to feel thinner, colder, and I was the insulation they had taken for granted for far too long. And maybe 10 years ago, that letter would have crushed me. Maybe I would have read it with shaking hands and wet eyes, desperate to believe that buried somewhere in those lines was the father I always wished I had, the one who might finally see me for more than what I could offer. But now, with the weight of every dismissed effort and every minimized moment still fresh in my mind, I saw it clearly for what it was, not an olive branch, but a lifeline thrown from a ship that had never bothered to include me on the passenger list. What struck me most wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't. There was no thank you. Not for the years I spent quietly covering their bills. Not for the gifts, the favors, the sacrifices. Not even for the Rolex that he still hadn't worn. There was no ownership of the hurt, no acknowledgement of the way he'd used pride as a shield and turned my generosity into a weakness to be mocked. Just this strange cocktail of flattery, regret, and manipulation wrapped in a few pages of ink and nostalgia. I sat with the letter for a while before I responded. I didn't want to reply in anger. I didn't want to match his subtle control with sharpness or cruelty. I wanted my words to be honest, clean, final, not loud, but undeniable. So I wrote back, not by text or email, but by hand, because sometimes the quietest gestures cut the deepest. Dear Dad, I began. I appreciate your letter. I've spent a long time trying to earn a kind of respect I now realize should have never come with a price tag. I gave without asking for anything in return, not even acknowledgement, because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd see me beyond what I could provide. But what I've learned is that some people aren't capable of seeing anything they can't control. And that's not mine to fix. I kept it short. No dramatic paragraphs, no lectures. Just the truth, clean and steady, laid out like the kind of closure he never gave me. I don't owe you my peace, I wrote in the final line. And I won't keep trading pieces of myself for a place at a table that never made room for who I actually am. Love can't be bought either. And neither can I anymore. Then I signed it, sealed it, and dropped it in the mailbox without looking back. Because sometimes silence isn't avoidance, it's self-respect. And I wasn't interested in begging for either anymore. It had been several quiet, peaceful months since I'd drawn my final line in the sand, since I'd folded that last letter and sent it off like a closing chapter one no longer wanted to reread. Life had shifted in ways that felt both subtle and seismic, small routines, softer mornings, dinners where I didn't worry about unpaid bills or unexpected phone calls asking for help dressed as conversation. I had built a rhythm that belonged entirely to me, one without financial obligation disguised as loyalty, one where my time, energy, and effort were finally mine to keep. And then came the day I knew would eventually arrive, the day I had to return, not out of guilt or reconciliation, but simply to retrieve the last few things I had left behind at my parents' house. I didn't dress up for it. I didn't plan what I'd say or try to rehearse some poised performance in case they tried to spark a heart-to-heart. I just drove out there on a gray, overcast afternoon and parked in the same driveway I used to shovel in the winters without being asked, back when showing up was the only way I knew how to be loved. As I stepped through the front door, it struck me instantly how quiet the house was, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, stagnant kind that clings to furniture and settles in the air when joy hasn't been home in a while. The walls looked a little more bare, the corners a little dustier, the rooms colder, not just from the lack of heat, but from the absence of warmth you only notice when it's been gone too long. My mother met me in the hallway, wearing that strange smile she always used when she didn't know how to bridge the space between tension and civility. She opened her arms for a hug, and I offered one, quick and polite, already feeling the weight of the visit settle between us like an unspoken conversation neither of us was ready to have. "You could have called more, you know," she said softly, her voice thick with that passive disappointment she always weaponized so gently that you almost didn't notice until it had already left a bruise. "We didn't know how you were doing." I smiled faintly, brushing past her words without picking them up. "I've been doing just fine," I replied, and that was the truth, because for once I truly had. She lingered in the doorway as I packed the last box from the guest room, her eyes scanning me like she was looking for some trace of the daughter she used to mold into a caretaker, the one who always said yes, always gave more than she had, always showed up even when no one asked her to. "You don't have to rush," she added quietly. "You could stay for dinner. Your dad's working late, but he'd love to see you." I paused for a moment, placing a book into the box and straightening my back slowly. "No, thank you," I said evenly, not cruelly, not bitterly, just final. "I've got plans." I didn't owe her an explanation, and I didn't offer one. Because the truth was, I had finally learned that walking away doesn't always require a slammed door or a tearful goodbye. It just takes resolve. It takes choosing yourself, even when the people who raised you still don't understand why you needed to. I carried the box to my car, waved goodbye at the doorstep, and left without looking over my shoulder, not because I didn't care, but because there was nothing left to salvage in a house built on conditional affection and unspoken hierarchies. There were no dramatic parting words, no last-minute apologies, no sudden realization on their part. Just silence, empty, awkward, overdue silence that echoed louder than anything they could have said. That night, I sat at my desk again, the same one where I drafted letters, paid their bills, sent thoughtful gifts they barely acknowledged, and I logged into my budgeting app. For the first time in years, the numbers reflected a life that was whole, no extra withdrawals, no shared expenses, no sudden surprises to account for. It was all mine now. Every dollar, every hour, every piece of peace. And with that clarity humming in my chest, I opened my blog again, fingers tapping keys with a rhythm that came not from rage, but from release. I titled the post, "The Currency of Conditional Love." In it, I wrote not about bitterness, but about boundaries, not about revenge, but about reclamation. I told the story as it was, not exaggerated, not softened, just true, down to the last word. Sometimes, I wrote, the sharpest revenge is simply pulling away and watching them realize they were never entitled to your sacrifice in the first place. I clicked publish without hesitation, and by morning, the post had already begun spreading, shared by people who'd lived their own versions of that silence, that dismissal, that cold dinner table where they were always expected to serve, but never to be seen. And as I stared at the final sentence on the screen, I let myself breathe deeply and fully, knowing this story was no longer theirs to control. Tell me, was I wrong to stop giving? Or did I finally start giving to the one person who always deserved it, myself?